force majeure, also known as acts of God, earthquakes, volcanoes, avalanches, and droughts, just to name some of the calamities that can befall, usually without warning. Then there are man-made catastrophes. The consequences of war spring rapidly to mind. Desperate Hours takes a hard-eyed look at some of the most dramatic disasters of the last 100 years. In this episode, you can run for cover, but you can't hide from the wild winds. That means hurricanes, cyclones, tornadoes, twisters, and typhoons. They are all pretty much different names for the same thing: powerful windstorms. Well, no, not necessarily. To simplify things, tornadoes and twisters both occur over land, while cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons form over the sea and mainly affect coastal regions, scattering as they move inland. The winds we'll be talking about on this show carry death, destruction, and heartbreak in their wake. We begin with the biggest blowout of this century, the hurricane they called Katrina. It was a tragedy on an enormous scale that left Louisiana, and indeed the entire United States, reeling in its aftermath.
The highest winds and highest storm surge are occurring now or have already occurred along the coast. Gradually will be subsiding later today.
Reaching wind speeds of up to 175 miles per hour, Katrina is ranked as the third most destructive tropical cyclone to make landfall in the US on record. The other two were the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 and Hurricane Camille in 1969. It is estimated that some 1,836 people died in the August 2005 hurricane and the ensuing floods. Millions more were rendered homeless along the Gulf Coast and in New Orleans, which was the site of the highest death toll.
It's all just torn up, everything.
This is about the worst one I've seen.
We're not used to seeing stuff like this.
There is a humanitarian crisis unfolding here in New Orleans. There are thousands of people trapped, running short of food and water, waiting for a bus out of here.
For the first time, the operation on these streets is changing from rescuing the living to recovering the dead. The problem is that most of the dead are either underneath this water or trapped in these houses. Now, until this floodwater is drained, they will remain there, the true death toll won't be known, and the floodwater may not be drained for several months.
America's party capital was badly flooded as the levee system failed in spectacular fashion. In some instances, hours after the storm had already moved inland. Approximately 80% of the city and many neighboring townships were flooded, with the floodwaters remaining for weeks to come. In terms of property damage, the worst of it occurred along a chain of Mississippi beachfront towns.
It just amazed me how it covered houses, cars moving down the street, just terrible.
I didn't think it would be as bad as it was, but it came through when tide was coming in. Our house got about a foot of water in it. Everything else around from our house down got about waist deep or higher.
Look at the destruction. Tore up. Anything else you'd like to add?
Many government officials came in for criticism after what was seen as a slow and slapdash response effort. Ray Nagin, the mayor of New Orleans, Kathleen Blanco, the governor of Louisiana, and US President George W. Bush were all lambasted. The president commented that New Orleans had dodged a bullet, yet this was after the White House was informed that the levees in New Orleans had broken and the city was flooding. Vice President Dick Cheney's office instructed a Mississippi electricity cooperative to restore power to a pipeline that sends oil and gas to the Northeast. Doesn't sound so bad. Well, except for the fact that it delayed the restoration of power to 2 rural hospitals. For the survivors just trying to stay alive, or even just afloat, the situation must have seemed helpless at times. Officials at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration later declared that Katrina was the most destructive storm to ever strike the United States. The trauma was certainly real in Myanmar a few years after, when Cyclone Nargis struck. A cyclone is a tropical storm, specifically a violent, rotating windstorm. The word violent somehow doesn't suffice to describe the utter devastation caused by Nargis. Stands on record as the worst natural disaster ever recorded in Myanmar. Making landfall on Friday in May 2008, the destruction was almost incomprehensible. And the fatalities? Estimates vary, but even the most conservative, issued by the Myanmar government, put the death toll at over 84,000 people, with another 53,000 plus listed as missing. Some 37 townships suffered significant damage, with the UN estimating that as many as 2.4 million people were affected. With winds in excess of 120 miles per hour, Cyclone Nargis became one of Asia's deadliest storms by hitting land at one of the lowest points above sea level in Myanmar, triggering a storm surge that reached some 25 miles inland. Those on the ground didn't need to hear statistics. They knew they were in the midst of a tragedy on a profoundly epic scale. Natural disasters, with their random, indiscriminate brutality, are one thing, but mankind's response is another. And this was one time where politics made a tragic situation worse than it had to be.
We now estimate that 2 million people have faced famine or disease as a result of the lack of cooperation of the Burmese authorities. This is completely unacceptable. There must be unfettered access to humanitarian agencies.
The United States has made an initial aid contribution, but we want to do a lot more. We're prepared to move U.S. Navy assets to help find those who've lost their lives, to help find the missing, and to help stabilize the situation. But in order to do so, the military junta must allow our disaster assessment teams into the country.
As a result of the cyclone, the bulk of health facilities in affected areas were either completely destroyed or greatly damaged.
elements now to make us very, very worried. We've got massive displacement of people. We've got inadequate water supplies. We've got people living in flooded situations. We have very little sanitation there. We have people displaced and living in crowded centers or in schools.
But when the ruling military junta refused entry into Myanmar by Western humanitarian aid workers, the plight of survivors became still more desperate. With the response of aid agencies thwarted, it became all too clear that in the wake of disaster, humanitarian assistance can't come fast enough. Hurricanes usually have their origins in tropical regions. They form over warm ocean water around 26 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And once they have gathered momentum, can be up to 600 miles across. They are comprised of strong winds spiraling inwards and upwards at up to 200 miles per hour. Hurricanes typically last for about a week, gathering heat and energy as they move over the warm ocean waters. Evaporation from the sea just serves to increase their power. The whirlwind revolves around its center, or the renowned eye of a hurricane. They twist and turn in anti-clockwise fashion in the northern hemisphere, but in a clockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. The center of the storm, or eye, is actually the tempest's calmest spot, where there are only light winds and generally fair weather. Yet once it makes landfall, the hurricane's heavy rain, strong winds, and large waves can cause devastation on an almost unimaginable scale. A tornado, on the other hand, is a rapidly spinning tube of air which touches both the ground and the clouds above. In the US, they are often referred to as twisters. The most violent tornadoes can attain wind speeds of up to 300 miles per hour. They can demolish large buildings, uproot trees, and pick up and hurl vehicles hundreds of feet away, as if they were mere playthings. The tornado's path of destruction can be anywhere in excess of 1 mile wide and some 50 miles long. 1,000 tornadoes are reported in the United States in a typical year. Fortunately, only 2% of these are labeled violent tornadoes. The majority of tornadoes form from thunderstorms. In the United States, for example, when warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico and cool, dry air from Canada meet, that's when the trouble begins. When these two air masses get together, they produce instability in the atmosphere. A change of wind direction and an increase in its speed creates a horizontal spinning effect in the lower atmosphere. Air rising within the resulting updraft tilts this rotating air column from horizontal to vertical. Tornadoes can occur at any time of the year, and no terrain is considered safe. That said, the US averages more tornadoes annually than any other country in the world. A world and time away from military juntas and political strife, the postcard picture-perfect Florida Keys. The setting for scenes of destruction, every bit as powerful as anything captured on film. That was the story when the winds whipped up to a Category 4 hurricane back in September 1960.
It swept over Florida with terrifying force. Rain fell in torrents, and the wind reached a velocity of more than 120 miles an hour.
When Hurricane Donna struck here, it had already caused death and destruction in Puerto Rico and other places in the Caribbean. As it lashed the Florida Keys, it repeated its vicious performance. The damage done was bound to run into millions of dollars. While Britain was basking in a few days of Indian summer, the east coast of the United States, including New York, suffered a trail of destruction as Donna continued on her ferocious course. Hurricane Donna had more serious consequences. This wild wind still holds the record for maintaining major hurricane status in the Atlantic Basin for the longest period, 9 days in total. Late in the afternoon on a Sunday in May 2011, the town of Joplin, Missouri was the stage for the kind of tornado that is capable of leveling whole neighborhoods in minutes.
Lost my house, lost my garage, lost my friend.
When they say that it sounds like a freight train coming, that's what I'd always heard, but I never. It's exactly what it sounds like, and the house was shaking.
Leveling suburbs in minutes is exactly what the Joplin tornado did. This town of 50,000 people lay directly in the path of the tornado, which was 3/4 of a mile wide at its worst. The tornado steamrolled over Joplin with winds in excess of 200 miles per hour, destroying more than 900 homes, killing over 150, cutting off telephones and electricity supplies, and knocking out a hospital. The destruction left behind a ravaged landscape that seemed surreal, almost alien. But there was another fascinating dimension to this natural disaster. With the town of Joplin known as the Buckle on the Bible Belt, many of the survivors claim to have had supernatural experiences. Both children and adults claim to have been protected by angels they call the butterfly people, or butterfly angels. These butterfly angels seemed real to some, and therapists did not try to dissuade believers. Their goal, as always, was to help people to process the trauma they'd experienced. So, whatever works. Why do violent hurricanes often have such safe, non-threatening sounding names? Katrina, for instance, or Hurricane Sandy, unofficially known as Superstorm Sandy. Sandy sounds like somebody's sister with freckles and a ponytail. But let's not be naive. Hurricane Sandy was the most lethal and devastating hurricane of the Atlantic hurricane season for 2012. Moreover, Sandy is listed as being, financially speaking, the second most costly hurricane in United States history. Sandy was formed in the Central Caribbean on October 22, 2012, and intensified into a hurricane as it traveled north through Jamaica, eastern Cuba, and the Bahamas.
Pasó sobre Jamaica con una intensidad de huracán categoría 1, con 130 kilómetros por hora, vientos máximos sostenidos y rachas de hasta 150, 160.
The storm is certainly it's still a hurricane for one thing, and it's now spinning just north of the Bahamas. And you can see from this satellite picture with Carolina up here and Florida here, it's becoming a very large storm system.
Hurricane Sandy is still about 200 miles off this coast, but you can feel her coming. Those waves have been measured at 35 feet just further out. Now, when that's combined with a high tide later and winds of around 80 miles an hour, they're going to carry those waves right over this boardwalk and smash into Long Island here.
When it made landfall in Cuba and the Caribbean, it did what you'd expect of any Category 1 hurricane. It left a path of destruction in its wake and was to blame for several fatalities. The beleaguered island nation of Haiti, still reeling from an earthquake earlier that year, suffered 51 casualties. But it was in New York and New Jersey where Sandy undoubtedly did the most damage of all. Concerned citizens and emergency services personnel had watched carefully as Sandy was reclassified as a tropical storm before strengthening again to a Category 1 hurricane. Informally, it became known as Superstorm Sandy. And when it finally hit the eastern seaboard on October 27th, no amount of precautions and preparations were going to stop it from wreaking havoc on an enormous scale, killing at least 117 people and leaving many, many more destitute and traumatized.
The beach might be up this street. They call it the city by the sea. Parts of it will soon be in the sea when high tide brings a huge surge of water. They're already getting out whatever way they can.
We stayed with my cousin last night. She has 5 kids of her own. I don't know what I'm gonna do. So we're here.
I'm trying to get some gas in my car. I'm getting out of the city. The city don't love me. I've been here my whole life. It's nothing. The ocean walked through my house, and I lost everything I own in 27 years, and I'm here 5 days and living in the street. I'm living in my car.
It's a lot worse than a few possessions, you know, because these can be replaced. But the community's been very helpful. You can see over there all the organizations that's giving food and blankets to everybody. So it's very heartwarming seeing the support of the community.
People think of hurricanes, they usually visualize a raging wind, swaying palm trees, and perhaps airborne debris. And while that does occur, that's not what takes people's lives. Water does. In fact, 90% of the fatalities in the United States due to hurricanes is due to water. Of course, most by drowning. Also want to emphasize that of that, 50% comes from storm surge.
We passed through the worst, you know. It's over us now, I guess, right?
In this episode of Desperate Hours, we have seen coastal regions ravaged by hurricanes. We have seen whole towns flattened by tornadoes. The only form of defense is to flee before they arrive or take cover. The force majeure has spoken. floods and famine, tornadoes and war, an airplane crash, or an earthquake. Natural disasters and man-made catastrophes, events that can cause enormous loss of life, destruction, and hardship. In desperate hours, you'll become an eyewitness to some of the most noteworthy disasters of the last 100 years. The Earth really moves in this episode as we look at one of the most devastating of all natural cataclysms, the earthquake, in all its destructive power. Of all the natural disasters we'll look at in this episode, none release more sheer destructive energy than an earthquake. After all, it takes a great deal of the Earth's energy for two of its magnetic plates to grind against each other long enough that they go snap and jolt the planet's outer crust for hundreds of square miles. The world watched with great sadness the great horror and heart-rending aftermath of the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal. The April 2015 Nepal earthquake, also known as the Gorkha earthquake, was responsible for over 8,000 deaths, with injuries many times over that.
Because it was so suffocating inside. I couldn't breathe.
People die inside the dead body inside the house.
It's a nightmare.
Yet even in the midst of such widespread tragedy, there are beacons of hope. A teenage boy is rescued from the rubble.
It's what we call an entombment. So he wasn't specifically crushed, but what he was inside of a box with heavy concrete all around him. So the USAID teams, what we did is we worked side by side with the local teams, and we were there to assist them in getting this victim out.
Across vast swathes of Nepal, entire villages were flattened, rendering hundreds of thousands of people homeless. Centuries-old buildings were obliterated at UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the Kathmandu Valley. The April 2015 earthquake also triggered an avalanche on Mount Everest, killing at least 19 and making for the deadliest day on the mountain in recorded history.
We saw huge pieces of rock and ice coming down from faces of Makalu right over there over Camp 2. Well, I'm pretty well fucked. I fell through that hole. Thankfully, I didn't keep falling that way. I got trapped here instead. On this ledge, my arm I can't use. Another sign of distraction.
People going through the rumbles, trying to figure it out. Is there anything left?
The initial earthquake's magnitude was registered at 7.8. It was followed by continuous aftershocks within 15 to 20-minute intervals.
Aftershocks can occur from days to weeks to months and sometimes even years after the main shock. So, I mean, it's within the time period for sure to expect aftershocks like this.
The capital city of Kathmandu, situated on a block of crust around 120 kilometers wide and 60 kilometers long, reportedly shifted 3 meters to the south in under 30 seconds. Thanks to this breathtaking footage, we can eyewitness this terrible tragedy. Then, 2 weeks after the devastating quake in which more than 8,000 people were killed, Nepal was hit by another major earthquake, this one with a magnitude of 7.3. This time, over 100 people were killed and thousands injured. There was widespread damage to buildings and property in much of the shell-shocked nation. Earthquakes have always been with us, but it is really only in the last 50 years or so that their devastating impact has been captured so vividly, not only in photographs, but in moving images broadcast around the world, at first via television, and in the last 20 years or so over the internet. Sichuan, the second largest of the Chinese provinces. It is located in the upper Yangtze River Valley in the southwestern part of the country. The Sichuan province earthquake of May 2008. It occurred on a weekday in the middle of the afternoon. School and university classes were in full swing. Office workers had returned to their desks after lunch. 80 kilometers from the 7.6 million person megacity of Chengdu, a fault line began to rupture. The resulting 7.9 magnitude earthquake in western China's mountainous Sichuan province would kill well over 8,000 people.
Suddenly, the ground just shook. There was this awful noise. And at first we thought maybe somewhere there was a landslide or something. We never imagined it was an earthquake. It just wouldn't stop. And it got louder and louder, and the rocks were just being thrown down the mountains at us.
于是就是看看好像大家都有这种反应，于是就都出来了，因为原来有那个做过紧急的演习嘛。
About 4,800,000 people were left homeless, and the scale of damage to property was estimated to be over $80 billion. When a disaster occurs on this sort of scale, it is hard to single out any one statistic as especially grim.
Because the earthquake occurred in shallow, that means about 10 kilometers beneath the ground. So the damage is usually very strong, devastating. In the 2008 Sichuan province earthquake, an estimated 10,000 children were trapped under rubble when school buildings collapsed. Many would die there. Unsurprisingly, there was a public outcry. A subsequent government investigation concluded that 1 in 5 primary schools may have been shoddily constructed and unsafe. For months after the quake, more than 20,000 students had to do with makeshift schools and classrooms. But reconstruction efforts went ahead with impressive speed. But no amount of reconstruction could erase the memories of those desperate hours in May 2008. But what causes earthquakes? When people talk about a seismic shift, what are they actually talking about? At the very bottom of the oceans lie the uppermost layers of the surface of our planet. The Earth's outer layer is known as the crust. The crust covers the Earth's surface a bit like a cracked eggshell. The various pieces that make up the crust are called geological or tectonic plates. The tectonic plates fit together a bit like a jigsaw puzzle with some rough edges, known more scientifically as fault lines. The tectonic plates move continuously against one another. Most of the time, they glide and slide along quite smoothly. Otherwise, there would be even more earthquakes. But every now and then, the tectonic plates catch, and the pressure gradually but steadily builds up. Finally, the pressure becomes too much, and the huge masses of rock which form the plates abruptly shift along the fault lines. This creates phenomenal waves of energy, spreading out in concentric circles, rather like waves in a pond if you throw a stone into the water.
Recently, especially the Japanese scientists, considering their past experience in earthquake prediction, they gave up to make investment on earthquake prediction, and that's why they concentrated on studies related to understand the physics of earthquakes.
Most earthquakes take place within the so-called Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean. At least once a year, Alaska experiences a 7.0 earthquake. California alone gets about 10,000 quakes a year, but most go unnoticed except by seismographs. Researchers at UC Berkeley are testing a prototype of an earthquake early warning system that California is pursuing years after places like Mexico and Japan already have them up and running.
It detects the very beginnings of earthquakes using seismometers very close to the epicenter and then predicts the shaking that's going to follow so that you can push out a warning to all of those in harm's way.
Indeed, while it is thought that globally there are as many as 500,000 earthquakes every year, only around 100,000 register on the Richter scale, and only about 100 of these cause any visible damage. It was during the first golden age of television, on an evening in May of 1960 in Chile, as this newsreel footage shows, that all hell broke loose.
Rubble and ruin in the Pacific port of Concepcion in Chile, which has suffered the worst series of earthquakes in all its history. Details of the damage cannot reveal the extent.
The 1960 earthquake in Chile was the largest of the 20th century. The so-called rupture zone was estimated to be around 1,000 kilometers in diameter, from Lebu in central Chile to Puerto Aysén in the extreme south of the country. The severest destruction in Chile occurred in the Valdivia-Puerto Montt coastal region. Practically every building in the port town of Puerto Saavedra was destroyed by waves reaching heights of 11.5 meters, which carried the remains of houses as far as 3 kilometers inland. Most of the casualties in Chile and beyond were the result of large tsunamis triggered by the initial quake. As touched on, the so-called rupture zone was some 1,000 square kilometers, but the reverberations were literally felt across the Pacific Ocean. There was destruction on Easter Island, in the Samoa Islands, and in California. In the destruction wrought by the 1960 earthquake, not only in Chile but across the Pacific, the final death toll was 1,655 people. In terms of sheer human cost, the worst earthquake of modern times occurred in Haiti on a January evening of 2010. Death toll estimates begin at about 220,000 people. By the end of the day, at least 52 aftershocks measuring 4.5 or greater had been recorded. An estimated 3 million people were affected by the quake. Haitian government sources estimated that 250,000 residences and 30,000 commercial buildings collapsed or were severely damaged. The earthquake caused major damage in Port-au-Prince, Jacmel, and other settlements in the region. Several notable landmark buildings were significantly damaged or completely demolished, including the Presidential Palace, the National Assembly Building, and the Port-au-Prince Cathedral.
Appelle Marie avec madame. Bon, qui ça pour me faire? Bon, qui ça pour me pas faire? Et madame Maté là, il y a 3 jours en deux jours à la moi si mettre le dehors en bas des dalles. Nous retirer sous lui.
I think in the next few days, people are going to be running out of food, out of water. I think we need help because it's urgent.
The mortuaries of Port-au-Prince were overwhelmed with tens of thousands of bodies, which had to be buried in mass graves. As rescue efforts tailed off, vital supplies, medical care, and sanitation were all in short supply.
It's a very shallow earthquake, and that very shallow depth, coupled with the size of the earthquake, meant that there was very strong ground shaking.
Actually, that fault is pretty similar to the San Andreas fault in the sense that it's what we call a strike-slip fault, where one side moves past the other in a horizontal fashion.
Any major natural disaster brings tragedy. But in the case of Haiti, it seemed a particularly cruel twist of fate. Before the earthquake of 2010, Haiti was already a pretty desperate sort of place. To give some idea, only a third of the people in Port-au-Prince had regular access to drinking water. The island nation was 145th of 169 countries in the UN Human Development Index, making it the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. So when epic disaster struck, the Haitians were not well prepared, to put it mildly. Delays in aid distribution led to protests from aid workers and survivors. There were instances of looting and outbursts of violence. The US and many other countries eventually responded to appeals for humanitarian aid.
I have directed my administration to respond with a swift, coordinated, and aggressive effort to save lives.
Practically all of Haiti's somewhat backwards communication systems, air, land, and sea transport facilities, hospitals, and electrical networks had been damaged by the earthquake. The almost non-existent infrastructure and arguably some condescending attitudes on the part of relief agencies seemed to hamper rescue and aid efforts, with logistical problems such as air traffic congestion making matters still worse.
Usually we have 150 doctors here for the hospital. Now I don't have 20.
And yet, even in spite of recent political unrest, the indomitable island nation of Haiti has recovered to a perhaps unexpected degree. Most of the 1.5 million people displaced by the earthquake and living in makeshift tents now live in acceptable housing conditions. Haiti's reconstruction program is in full swing. Throughout Haiti, Ambitious infrastructure programs are visible, including roads, bridges, and social housing projects. Like beleaguered Haiti, you would think that Kashmir, the setting of a prolonged, sometimes violent border dispute between India and Pakistan, already had enough problems. But a massive earthquake on October 8, 2005 only added to the province's woes. The devastating earthquake shook the western Himalayas and adjoining regions in the morning. A magnitude 7.6 earthquake. It killed something like 80,000 people, injuring tens of thousands, and caused extensive damage in northern Pakistan, leaving millions homeless.
आज सुबह इंतहाई शदीद किस्म का झटका ज़लज़ले का लगा है और हम फौरी तौर पर तमाम लोग जो बच्चे भी सोए हुए थे इधर-उधर उठकर बाहर आ गए और काफी देर तक ये झटके महसूस हुए और आज तक ये ऐसा ज़लज़ला हमने नहीं देखा।
मेरे रिश्तेदार कम से कम अगर है ना 10-15 रिश्तेदार हमारे जो इसमें मर गए। टोटली सारे मिला के कितने हजार? ये इस टाइम तो 10,000 से कम 20-30 हजार से ऊपर है।
I've lost my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, his wife, his little baby child of 8 months, we've heard, my aunt, my 3 uncles, his son.
A reported 32,335 buildings collapsed in Kashmir, and in Pakistan, in places as far away from each other as Islamabad, Lahore, and Rawalpindi. Across the border in India, at least 1,300 people were killed and 6,000 injured. The international response was fast, but the remote mountainous terrain that typifies Kashmir just served to compound problems for recovery efforts, with rescue teams struggling to reach the injured.
As you can see, it's total devastation, and we're here to do what we can. We've just taken one live man from the house behind me now, and he's off to hospital, so we're going to pack up our stuff and go and look for somewhere else now.
We're struggling because of the remoteness, we're struggling because of logistics, we're now struggling because of the weather and the terrain. You know, as a human being, as a human professional, these are absolutely desperate times. You know, we had torrential rain last night. I spoke to the General this morning at 2,000 meters here, which isn't far from here. Temperature was -3. These people were outside. They were wet. They're now cold. We're going to have people dying. We're going to have people coming down with diseases.
Landslides and rockfalls damaged or destroyed mountain roads and highways, cutting off access to the region for several days. Even with today's technology, such as laser beams which detect plate movement, and a machine called a seismometer, earthquakes are still difficult to predict. As for being prepared, earthquake-proof buildings and roads, plus training in earthquake drills, all have their merits. Many a life has been saved in this way. But there are limits, especially when you take into account the awesome power of nature. Learning to live each day in the knowledge that desperate hours might just be around the corner is a vital part of what makes life so precious.